By the 11th and 12th centuries, Western Europe was unmistakably Christian. Kings were being crowned by bishops, and universities were founded under church authority. Cathedrals rose over cities like theological monuments set in stone. It's clear that the church was no longer just surviving in history, it was shaping it on a massive scale. But as we saw last week, the church was now also not as united as it had historically been. The Great Schism left Eastern and Western Christianity in divided factions, both doing what it took in their own worlds to organize their own systems of theological thought and ecclesiastical order. This is, by the way, why I mentioned that there were only 7 ecumenical councils. An ecumenical council was supposed to speak for the entire church. Well, after the Great Schism, where East and West divided, none of the councils that were held in the West applied to the East, and those held in the East didn't apply to the West. They could no longer be called ecumenical, and they only had jurisdiction over their unique faction of Christianity. So today, we are now entering into a period called the High Middle Ages, roughly about 1000 to 1300, and it marks the height of medieval Christendom. And at its center stands the papacy. In earlier centuries, the Bishop of Rome, as we have talked about before, had special influence, there's no doubt. But, as we saw last week, when we move into the Middle Ages, whoever filled the position of the Bishop of Rome had started to obtain an unmistakable dominance over leadership. In this age especially, popes would have increasing authority, and they would increasingly assert their authority not only over bishops and churches and congregations, but over kings and queens and princes and royalty. One of the strongest expressions of this came through the doctrine of papal supremacy, which is the belief that the Pope held ultimate spiritual authority over the entire church, and in some cases, moral authority over rulers themselves. Yes, at times in this period, we will see that the Pope excommunicated kings. They mediated disputes between monarchs. The papal office became one of the most powerful institutions in all of Europe. And that meant that the line between spiritual leadership and political dominance grew thinner and thinner. Now, to be fair, much of this power emerged actually from reform movements. The church in the 10th century had become a mess, and it had suffered from corruption to the extent that reform seemed necessary to almost everyone involved, except for the crooked individuals themselves. And so a series of reforms took place at the end of the 10th century and really in the beginning of the 11th to fix the corruption in the Catholic Church. Now, first there were the Cluniac reforms, or sometimes called the Benedictine reforms. And this focused on fixing the problems of medieval monasticism. That's right, the order of monks and abbeys. Then a little later, under Pope Gregory VII, there was what we call the Gregorian reforms. And these focused on fixing a surplus of issues, but I'd like to give you 4 important ones that it directly dealt with. The first was simony. Simony was the buying of church offices, and it takes its name from Simon in the book of Acts, who tried to buy his position from the apostles and was condemned for it, Simon the magician. The buying of church offices has become a major problem, and the Gregorian reform sought to fix it. Then there was the clerical immorality and sexuality that was going on. Clerics were practicing immoral behavior more so than much of the average populace, and that was becoming a major problem for the spiritual clarity of the church. Third, there was a lot of political manipulation. People were using their spiritual position in order to gain monetary and earthly privilege. And does that sound so different than what we see so often in the news today? And then fourth and finally, there was this thing called the investiture controversy. Now, what was that? What does this weird thing mean? The investiture controversy was a major struggle that occurred between the papacy, especially reformer Pope Gregory VII, and secular rulers, especially Henry IV, the Holy Roman Emperor, who had the authority to appoint bishops and abbots. Well, the Pope was not thrilled with the idea that the Roman emperor or the monarchy could appoint bishops and abbots to the church. The Pope believed, and many of the church order with him, that only the church should have that distinction. This is a deep battle over whether the church was going to be controlled by political rulers or remain independent under its own papal authority. Now, in many ways, these reforms did succeed. The church became more centralized. Clergy discipline actually improved overall, and the church became administratively stronger. But these reforms also consolidated more authority for the church and for the Pope. And now the papacy, more than ever before in all of history, had a strong global power, unprecedented in its age. Consolidated power, unchecked, could become a problem. And as we see in our story, it certainly did. In 1095, at the Council of Clermont, the Pope at the time, who was Urban II, issued a call that would reshape the medieval world. Christian pilgrims at that time often traveled to Jerusalem to worship or for trade for different variety of reasons, but a lot of them would go to the Holy Land to worship. As they would travel to Jerusalem, they increasingly faced much danger on the road, specifically from Muslim powers that controlled so much of the Holy Land. Christian pilgrims to Jerusalem often had to be on the lookout and were often taken advantage of, murdered, and stolen from Muslim-controlled areas in that part of the world. At the same time as all of that was happening, a plea was issued from the Eastern Byzantine Emperor, where he asked the West to send military aid against advancing forces from Anatolia. So Pope Urban II, he thought of a solution to try to fix both, and it was swift and it was dramatic. He called for Christian knights in medieval Europe to take up arms and travel east, not merely as pilgrims, but as soldiers. Their mission was to defend fellow Christians and also reclaim sacred holy sites, especially Jerusalem. The public's response to Urban's solution was actually pretty astonishing. It was supported on a massive scale. Thousands across Europe took vows to become knights or to become pilgrims, to go into the Holy Lands, to engage in this battle. They stitched crosses on their garments and began the long march toward the Eastern Mediterranean, ready to defend Christendom and take back the Holy Land. And this began what we know as the Crusades. For nearly 2 centuries, the Crusades lasted, with wave after wave of crusading armies moving between Europe and the Middle East. Now, first, I would just like to say many participants in the Crusades had deeply religious motivation. Medieval Christians believed that the Holy Land was a specially sacred ground. It was the place where Christ had lived and died and rose again. And the idea that access to these sites was going to become restricted or controlled as it was by religious enemies, it stirred strong, fervent emotion in many people. So they embraced the Crusades as a spiritual act. But it would be foolish to think that that was the only driving motivation. See, at that time, the Pope also promised spiritual benefits to crusaders who went to fight in a crusade, including forgiveness for all of the sins for anyone who died on the campaign. That is certainly a sign of spiritual manipulation. And yet, if we're even more honest as we look at the Crusades, it shows us that not every ideal of the person fighting was spiritual or religious. Political ambitions played a major role. Some nobles went and fought in the Crusades because they sought land or political power. Others were driven just simply by the thrill of adventure and economic opportunity. In short, you can see that the Crusades were a mixed bag. This strange and strong concoction of sincere devotion, cultural fear, political ambition, and human frailty. Like much of history, the Crusades were very, very complicated, and their legacy is no different. Overall, there were 8 crusades spanning between 1096 and 1272. Each of these produced moments of bravery and sacrifice, but they also produced much tragedy. In the later crusades especially, it seemed that that initial rhetoric of protecting the Christian had been thrown out completely. Violence started to occur towards civilians who were not engaged in the conflict. Jewish communities in Europe were starting to be attacked by the crusading mobs, though they had no real dog in the fight. And in 1204, during the Fourth Crusade, Western Crusaders sacked the Christian city of Constantinople, which is where the Eastern Church found its center. That's right. Western crusading Christians attacked the central capital of Eastern Christianity. And you can imagine what that did to the schism that already existed. It, of course, deepened the emotions and divide between Eastern and Western's expression of Christian belief. Yet, it is important to note that because of events like these, even at the time of the Middle Ages, the Crusades were not universally accepted or embraced by all people or by all Christians. Many Christians wrestled with whether it was truly reflective of Jesus' teachings to take things by bloodshed and warfare. Among these voices was one most remarkable figure by the name of Francis of Assisi. Now, who was Francis of Assisi? Well, his story is so much that I could not possibly do it justice right now. But I would like to show his influence during this crusading period. During the Fifth Crusade, Francis, or Saint Francis, did something almost unimaginable. Instead of joining the fight, he crossed the battle lines, unarmed, and he sought an audience with the Muslim ruler Al-Kamil. Francis hoped not to conquer his enemy, but to witness to the Muslim ruler about Christ through humility and peace. Now, as we know, this meeting did not end the war, but it stands as a powerful reminder that even during the crusading era, some Christians believed the gospel should advance not through the sword, but through love, sacrifice, and faithful witness. Now, this episode has to be a two-parter because all of the history of the High Middle Ages is so much to comprehend. But I do want to leave us with a few main takeaways as we come to a close. First, I want us to remember that sinful men can corrupt holy systems. We see this in the Bible as well. Just because something is set apart for God does not mean that it always makes the right choices or does the right things when sinners get involved. And we see that with the Pharisees in the New Testament. We see that with the church in the Middle Ages. There was a lot of corruption. And we have to recognize that just because somebody has Christ on their lips and crosses stitched on their garments does not necessarily mean that they honor the way, the truth, and the life. But second, even as we recognize that, we also have to realize that God still reigns, and a faithful remnant remains as well. God still preserves his church, even when there are unfair Christians, even when there are unjustified Christian acts that take place. God is still in control. God is still who he says he is. And just because there are people who are poor witnesses to him or of him does not mean that his name is any less or that his truth is any less true. God is still on the throne. And it still is important to remember that even as Christians make a surplus of horrible historical mistakes, that does not take away from the truth that Christ is Lord and his way will prevail. So even as I tell all of these horrible things that take place in the church at this time, remember, this does not take away from the truth that Jesus is the King and that he will call his people home.